History of Columbiana County and Representative Citizens, written in 1905 by William McCord. Chapter 10. The Earth's Hidden Treasures. Salt, coal, oil, and gas. Columbiana County drew wealth from the earth during the early days, not only in iron ore and clays, but also in salt and coal. Her people were pioneers as well in the oil field, and in the southern part of the county was the first community in the United States to pipe gas for fuel. Salt wells. Salt boiling was in the early days an important industry. Salineville, where the industry thrived most largely, received its name from its salt wells. Salt at the beginning of the century was a precious commodity in the West, ranking with the luxuries of the pioneer days. It brought higher prices than even sugar and flour, since it had to be brought over the mountains from the east. Frequently, the ruling price was $5 a bushel, and even then the supply was often exhausted for weeks in the little settlements in the sparsely inhabited region. Packing salt over the mountains was a business much followed in those days by enterprising traders, and until the salt springs of Columbiana County began to give up their yield, was attended with large profits. Stories are still told of the days when early settlers rode many miles to obtain a supply of salt and prized it to an extent that in later years seemed ridiculous. Salt springs were early found here and there throughout the southern part of the county, and finally settlers began making explorations and boring wells for the precious staple. The industry quickly became profitable and was carried on for more than half a century until the cheapness of the product shipped in from Michigan and New York State put an end to the business. George James, who came to Salineville from Kentucky, is said to have bored the first salt well in Columbiana County in 1809. He obtained a strong pressure of water with but little salt, though he drilled 2 wells, the first 300 feet, from which there was a strong flow of gas, and the second 900 feet. James Sharp sank 3 wells at about the same time. Several persons put down wells but failed to find salt in sufficient quantities. In 1818, John Farmer, who had come to Salineville from New Garden, Hanover Township, bought 3 abandoned wells that had been put down by 3 brothers named Burson and went into the salt business on a large scale. Farmer caught the business at its high tide, and, having considerable capital to invest, made money. The industry reached its height in the vicinity of Salineville about 1835, at which time there were 20 producing wells along Little Yellow Creek. At that time, Farmer's output was more than 50 barrels a week, and he had meantime been joined by his son, James Farmer, later prominent in the development of the coal interests around Salineville and in the building of the Cleveland and Pittsburgh Railroad. Farmer continued the business until 1853, when he sold it to Isaac Kirk, who operated the wells with more or less success until 1865, when the business ceased to be profitable about Salineville. The business had decreased rapidly after 1835. However, the state of Ohio reports for 1841 showing but 8 salt wells in operation in the county, with a production of 2,800 barrels of salt yearly. Notwithstanding this apparent decline of the industry, a company formed in 1866, composed of about 30 men, most of them from New Lisbon, abandoned a search for oil in that year and turned their attention to the manufacture of salt. The company had been organized to test the rumored oil deposits along the middle fork of Little Beaver Creek, a short distance northwest of New Lisbon. At about 687 feet depth, salt water was struck, and simultaneously a strong vein of gas. The gas and salt water shot up 100 feet above the surface, the gushing process continuing for several days. The search for oil was abandoned, and the manufacture of salt was continued for many years successfully. While the well continued to flow, for about 2 years, the yield of salt was 15 barrels a day. Then, for several years, the gas was used for fuel under the boiler, and by the pumping process, the yield of salt was increased to 30 barrels a day. The company dissolved in a few years, but R.G. Eels continued to operate the plant with good success until almost 1880, that being the last production of salt in Columbiana County. Peter Young was president of the company. John A. Myers, Secretary and Balzer Brown, James Starr, R.G. Eels, and J.A. Morin among the stockholder. Several salt wells were bored during the 1840s and 50s between East Liverpool and Wellsville, but the industry never proved successful. In 1880, the county was accredited with 9 producing wells, and the production was given at 43,800 bushels. In the following year, 1881, only 1 well was in operation.